Hi, I'm Deborah Schmit-Lobis, and I am a pianist and educator, a composer, and I'm on the faculty of the Center for Musical Arts, amongst a million other things. But why I'm here is to tell you about a fabulous concert coming up. Sunday, July 14th at 6:30 p.m. We will be hearing Schoenberg's Verklärte Nacht, which is also called Transfigured Night. And since I'm not German, I'm going to keep calling it Transfigured Night, as well as Bruckner's Symphony No. 4, which also is quite transcendental. But first, I'm going to talk a bit about Schoenberg, because most of his life he was associated with conflict. And as I'm sure most of us know, he's one of the proponents of 12-tone music, but he didn't always write in that kind of realm of music. In fact, he was quite schooled in the chromaticism of Wagner and really the formal integrity of Brahms' music. So he was pretty much self-educated. He grew up a poor Jewish man, but he composed enough that he got into the university realm of people and was sometimes looked down upon, possibly to his advantage, because he didn't pander. There was no sophistry involved. He just did what he did. He became quite a theoretician. He taught theory. He was very good at that sort of thing. And in that milieu at the time, there was always this big controversy between, well, should we go with Brahms and form and structure, or should we get into Wagner, which is more programmatic music? So there was always this thing going on between critics and composers and the contrast, and it seemed to be a big deal. At the time that Schoenberg wrote Transfigured Night, it was 1899. He was actually born in 1874. He lived well into this century. He didn't pass away until 1951. So Transfigured Night, 1899. Well, at this point in time, he was, learning. He was finding his own voice. And I would say that at this point, he was somewhere in between the Wagner and the Brahmsian realm. And you will see this particular piece, Transfigured Night, was inspired by a beautiful poem, but probably not, it had nothing to do, it has nothing to do with chromaticism in the same way as possibly getting into 12-tone. And let me just say one thing about 12-tone music. It's really an organic growth, I believe, from the composers of that era, an evolution, if you will. 12-tone gets into no key signatures, no major, no minor. It's just music. So that was the beginning of something. But as I said earlier, this composition, Transfigured Night, was really not at all anything to do with 12-tone music yet. So in about 1898, he made an important discovery in a volume of poetry, and it was called Woman and World. And it was by the modernist, somewhat controversial poet named Richard Demel. In these poems, Demel articulated a philosophy of transformation that sought to reconcile the contradictions, such as male-female, subject-object, God and nature, light and darkness. This was all done through the unity of poetic forms. So, considering all that, I think that's exactly what the music does. At one point, Schoenberg writes a letter to Demel, quote, what he says about it. And this is dated December 13th, 1912. He wrote, "Your poems have had a decisive influence on my development as a composer. They were what first made me try to find a new tone in the lyrical mood, or rather, I found it even without looking, simply by reflecting in music what your poems stirred up in me." So what these poems stirred up in Schoenberg was that desire to create new forms that are expressive. It's like a unity that hadn't yet happened in his work. And that poem, those poems helped create that. I'm going to read a bit of that poem because it's known for its beauty. So basically, in the poem, a woman and her lover are walking on this dark, moody night. I'm not going to read the full poem, but she says, or it says, she walks on, stumbling. She looks up. The moon keeps pace. Her dark gaze drowns in light. A man's voice speaks. Do not let the child you have conceived be a burden on your soul. Look how brightly the universe shines. Splendor falls on everything around. You are voyaging with me on a cloud sea. But there is the glow of an inner warmth from you in me, from me in you. That warmth will transfigure the stranger's child, and you bear it me, begot by me. You have transfused me with splendor. You have made a child of me. And he puts his arms around her. Their breath embraces the air. Two people walk on through the high, bright night. Now, when it starts, it's a gloomy night. So all of this is really evident in the music. As you can hear, a woman is walking with her lover, and she suddenly has to tell him that she's pregnant with another man's child. But the light starts to shimmer and glimmer. And through that sort of translucent kind of evening, the man basically tells her, your child will be mine. I will take care of it. We will make this work. Therefore, the transfigured night, because they're really transforming their own lives in order to make this work. They're not going by the mores of the day. They are creating their own world. And I think Schoenberg was very taken with that idea, very romantic. And for all of, his theory and intensely intellectual background, he was, in fact, a very romantic man. It's really not until, I think right around 1920 or so, that's when he started making that, what we think is a radical departure from regular major and minor keys into 12-tone. His suite for piano, his first 12-tone piece, was written between 1921 and 23. And it's really the earliest of his music to employ the row of 12 tones related only to one another. So that's how you think of 12-tone music. So on this concert, we also have Anton Bruckner. He was born in 1824, again in Austria. He was an interesting man. He was the son of basically a village schoolmaster and organist. And he showed talent by the time he was about 4. And by 10, he was already playing church organ. When he was, I think, something like 13 or 14, his father died, and he entered a monetary school in St. Florian as a choir boy. They had a magnificent organ there, and he became quite a magnificent organist and wrote a lot of organ music in the future. In the meanwhile, he trained, after this for years, he trained in Linz as an assistant schoolmaster. And he was holding appointments as a school teacher in different cities, but he did return to St. Florian as a fully qualified elementary school teacher in 1845. Now, in the meanwhile of all that, he had been studying organ. He did some online, well, not online, by mail study of theory with a Viennese teacher named Simon Sector. But before all that, he became organist at the Abbey Church. And during the time that he was in St. Florian, he wrote the Requiem in D minor. Because he grew up Catholic, a choir boy, an organist, he always remained to be a certain spiritual kind of mentality. So he wrote a lot of church music and a lot of divine things. And he's really considered one of the, I think, the most important music writers of Roman Catholic liturgy and motets and other kinds of music. So his spiritual life was very, very important. So he was persuaded, he got a little tired of the scene, so to speak, in St. Florian. There wasn't a whole lot to do. Although he was very much a peasant man, and when you'd see him on the street, you know, he never walked around like some composer might or some conductor. He was very much a peasant at heart and very much a religious man. So I think he cut an unusual figure. All right. But he had this appetite for musical study, revision, improvement, and he loved practicing and improvisation on the organ. And he always had this simplicity of character, but his music did not. And that's what was so interesting. It's even said that in his private life, he took on this unhappy pattern of passionate but unrequited attachments to young teenage girls. Now, in this day and age, that would probably not be allowed and probably wasn't loved then either. But I think that was his character. Okay. So who knows? We don't know that much about all that. So as I said, he's quite the organist. He began writing symphonies, and there are some characteristic things in his symphonies. He had this boldness and originality in his music, but it was met and mocked by a very famous critic at the time, Eduard Hanslick. He was the champion of the German composer Johannes Brahms and was sort of, you know, it wasn't into Wagner. But Bruckner was a fervent admirer of Wagner. So Hanslick didn't really give him much to go on. He didn't love Bruckner and made it difficult for him as a critic might. At one point, he did get a long sought after appointment as a lecturer at the University of Vienna, in spite of Hanslick. And he ended up writing a lot of chamber music, and he wrote 11 symphonies. I read that Symphony number 9 is unfinished. There's a lot of controversy about his symphonies because he was a person who revised things. As soon as Hanslick, the critic, would say, well, in the third movement of Bruckner's 7th Symphony, the Adagio is blah, 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 too long or too short or whatever it was. Mr. Bruckner would go and revise it. So he's one of those people, as strong-willed as he was and intensely appreciated as a scholar, he also had this reputation that he couldn't make up his mind. So in the symphony we're going to hear, which is number 4, that was written in, let's see, 1874. It's called the Romantic Symphony. And in 1878, it was played again after major revisions. It wasn't premiered until 1881. And then there were even more revisions in 1886, but I think the one we're going to hear is probably the revisions from 1881. It's the most often played. So it's kind of a reputation for writing symphonies that have a lot in common. So as interesting as this is going to sound, really, you could say the first movements of Bruckner's symphonies open quietly. Tonal interplay is often hinted at in the first bars, and then these movements are in sonata form. Bruckner uses three contrasting themes in the exposition rather than the usual two. The second theme is often song-like, with melodic strands happening simultaneously. The music builds up to climaxes in a terraced or stair-step fashion by means of climbing up sequential repetitions. Now, I'm saying this about the first movement of Symphony No. 1. This is probably true for all of his symphonies. So he always has this way of creating things, of building up to these climaxes. And this happens in almost every movement. So I'm going to read a little bit of what happens in the adagios. The second movements typically consist of long drawn-out alteration of two thematic groups. These slow movements, which build up to massive climaxes, often attain an incomparable sublimity. And, those second movements sometimes can be up to 30 minutes. The third movement, or the scherzo movements, are usually based on dance rhythms, changing up the tempo and have these kind of pounding and insistent themes. And again, kind of achieve a gigantic quality. The trio of the scherzos usually is more of a peasant dance, like what Bruckner would have grown up with in the country. The final movement is like the first, built on a three-subject expanded sonata form and incorporating elements of the first three movements. Both the first and the last movements of Bruckner's symphonies usually have mightily expanded codas with blazing kind of, he builds things, let's just say, he builds things to this point. In the fourth symphony, which we're going to hear on this concert, he uses horns in a way that is it sounds like a hunt, like we're going to a hunt. He has this mature style. I'm going to read here a bit. It talks about his ability to incorporate archaic forms with his own advanced style. His fondness for sudden contrasts of timbres and dynamics and his use of magnificent brass effects all testify to his boldness and originality. His orchestration is remarkable, economical, however, and is quite unlike the lavish homogeneity of Wagner's. He uses families of instruments that are sounded alternately in contrasted groups. So you might listen for this. The brasses against the woodwinds, achieving a beautiful and monumentally out of all proportion of the relatively modest number and type of instruments involved. So he has a way of orchestrating that really brings this out. None of Bruckner's symphonies are programmatic, except insofar as they are charged with the grandeur of God. So as I said earlier, he's quite a spiritual man, and that is inherent in all his music. At the party that was had, where Peter Ungen unveiled the season, he talked about Bruckner, and he said he walks off stage sometimes after he's conducted, and he's tired. He said he's always in awe that when he walks off the stage of doing a Bruckner symphony, he feels elated. So keep that in mind as you go to this concert, because I think not only Bruckner, with that inherent spiritual attitude throughout that he writes with, as well as the Schoenberg, these are monumentally important symphonic pieces or chamber music ensembles that are some of the most beautiful in the orchestral repertoire. And I've said it before, but there is nothing like being present with a live orchestra playing this kind of music. Please, let's keep supporting this and don't let it die. It's a wonderful thing. The Colorado Music Festival, conducted by Peter Ungen. This will be Sunday, July 14th, 6:30 p.m. See you there.